This is the Silicon Valley Clean Energy Authority Board of Directors special meeting on Friday, June 10th, 2022. This meeting will be conducted in accordance with the California Government Code Section 59953E. In consideration of the coronavirus, all members of the Silicon Valley Clean Energy Board of Directors and staff will be participating in this meeting via teleconference. Members of the public may observe this meeting electronically. Public comments can be sent in advance, or you can raise your hand during this meeting. Let's see. The public may provide comments on any matter listed on the agenda. Speakers are customarily limited to 3 minutes each. However, the board chair may increase or decrease the time allotted to each based on the number of speakers, agenda, and the complexity of the subject matter. Speaking time will not be decreased to less than 1 minute. If you are an individual with a disability and need reasonable modification or accommodation pursuant to the American with Disabilities Act, please contact board clerk Andrea Pisano at andrea.pisano@siliconvalleysvcleanenergy.org, preferably prior to the meeting. And with that, may we have a roll call vote?
Yes, thank you, Chair. And this is in no particular order. Chair Gibbons,
Here.
Vice Chair Tyson,
Here.
Dr. Abekoga,
Here.
Dr. Chua,
Here.
Dr. Fleiger,
Here.
Dr. Klein,
Here.
Director Lee,
Here.
Dr. Rennie,
Here.
Director Walia.
Here.
Thank you. And I will move on to our alternate directors. Alternate Director Larson,
Here.
Alternate Director Matichak,
Here.
Alternate Director Meadows,
Here.
Alternate Director Way,
Here.
Alternate Director Schmidt.
Here.
Thank you. And that looks like that concludes our roll call. No additional directors or alternates are present. We
Wonderful.
have a quorum.
Thank you so much. Welcome to all of you. Director Lee, nice to have you with us as well with your calendar. Thank you for joining. So thank you for coming this morning. It is going to be an exciting and interesting beginning of a workshop series for all our board members and alternates. We are at a very interesting, and that's a euphemism for saying an opportunity to keep on learning, at a pivotal moment for the industry in California as it meets the competing threats of wildfires, reliability needs, and the urgency of solving the climate crisis. We've been really fortunate to get great information and strategic recommendations on these issues from Silicon Valley Clean Energy staff over the years. And we're thinking now 5 years, we've got a lot of knowledge on this, but we know how much the agency has grown and how our responsibilities have changed as our PPAs come on board, and our session brought about some new understanding of the issues coming forward with DPUC regulations and the overall marketplace. So this workshop is a series came about to help the board approach these issues in a comprehensive manner. The materials that Silicon Valley staff has put together today are intended to start a longer conversation, beginning with a refresher on energy fundamentals and continuing with a deep strategic dive into the Silicon Valley Clean Energy's near and long-term challenges and opportunities. Since we are a major player and a thought leader in communities, climate vision, and in our region, if not certainly the state. Last night, I had a chance to chat with Senator Josh Becker, who's being more in the South Bay cities. He acknowledged that he is delighted to be working with Silicon Valley Clean Energy staff, and he is well aware of the innovations that Silicon Valley Clean Energy is to the table. And I thought that was a very positive, exciting comment to be made from someone who isn't totally in our area right now. So I'm looking forward to expanding that opportunity. So that was great. Now I'm going to hand this back to staff I want to thank them for the very thoughtful and engaging workshop today. They put together a real opportunity, but also discussion. So please feel free to engage, ask questions. It's the dialogue that's going to help all of us understand our roles going forward and help staff prepare the information for us. So thank you very much to Girish, to Maren, to Nick, to Monica, Andrea all the time, and everyone else on the staff that pulls us together. So thank you. And Girish, you want to take it from here?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just a little bit of feedback. Your voice is coming through at about 80%. It seems to be a little choppy, so just FYI for you for when you ask questions or make comments. So I'm going to just spend a couple of minutes and we'll throw up a slide up here, and then I'm going to go off video. And Maren Wenzel will be our presenter for today. So if we can go to the next slide, please, and maybe even the third slide, just jump there. Yeah, here we go. So here are the goals that we have for today's workshop. And at SVCE, we are spending more than $250 million a year on power supply. So it really behooves us to have a board that is well educated, so that the challenges of the future and the amount of money that we spend, we get very informed feedback from all of you. We really appreciate the time and the effort that you spend in being engaged with the work that we do. And thanks to both the alternates and the board members over here who are very active. So as you go through the workshop, you'll see that we are teeing up issues that are coming up in the future. And as we talked about in our strategic planning updates, there's the past 5 years, we've been extremely successful, but the industry's changed and we need to be looking at changes we're doing on how we procure, how we work on the demand side, how we work with transportation and buildings. We hope that this will be kind of a foundational educational session, and we will be happy to set up one-on-one meetings with one or more of you to go through any of these issues in detail. And we'll also be taking notes as we go through the workshop to inform us for the agenda for future workshops that we'll be having. Next slide. So this is the agenda, and I'm going to just we have, with questions, it will be pretty packed. It's just 2 hours, which actually ends up being about 90 minutes of like presentation, hopefully about 20 minutes or so of questions. And at different times, we have a time over here. So at some points, if we go too long, we may just pivot and then capture questions for answering later. With that, I'm going to introduce Maren Wenzel, who works in Monica's group. She's a senior manager for policy and planning, and she's going to be running pretty much this entire workshop. Maren, over to you.
All right, thank you, Girish, and thanks, Chair Gibbons, also for your comments, and thanks everyone for joining. I know not everyone necessarily wants to spend their Friday afternoons geeking out about energy policy, but I appreciate all of your time and hope this proves to be a productive session for everyone. As Girish already sort of teed up how we're going to spend our time today, we're going to spend hopefully about 15 minutes giving really a refresher or an energy 101, just to make sure that the entire board is level set on some key concepts in the energy sector that we're going to talk about throughout the day. We're then going to pivot a little bit and go through some key trends and potential challenges and opportunities that we see emerging in the California policy space and in the markets here. They're at a high level issues that I think you all are somewhat familiar with. We're going to be talking about renewables and storage, resource retirements and reliability, and demand side innovations. But hopefully this opportunity to take a step back and look at some of these issues a little bit more holistically and think about how they impact the markets and the regulatory space will be helpful, as Girish said, as we start having more conversations on strategic issues going forward. The whole impetus for this workshop initially was to talk about the integrated resource plan. So even though much of the conversation today is going to be about sort of big picture theoretical stuff, we will zoom in at the end and talk about where SVCE is with our IRP quickly at the end. And then hopefully there'll be some time to do some recap and have additional conversation. Certainly don't want to spend the next 90 minutes just talking at you. So we'll make sure to take some opportunities to stop and have short discussions. And please feel free to chime in with any questions as we go through as well. But with that, I think we can jump ahead to our energy basics. And first, I'll sort of hopefully not scare you all too much, but there is some trivia throughout the deck today. We are not doing a live poll, so we're not keeping track of score here, but would appreciate it if you all want to play along at home. So we'll jump in with our first trivia question, which is, which of these appliances uses the most power in watts? We have a number of answers here. So A is 30 LED light bulbs, B is a desktop computer, C is a heat pump water heater, D an L1 EV charger, E a pool pump, F a vacuum, or G a window AC unit. So I'll give you all just a second to think on that, but not too long because as Girish mentioned, we do have a pretty packed agenda. So hopefully you have some guess in your head. And the answer is G, a window AC unit. Want to jump sort of a step ahead here and also point out that while a window AC unit demands quite a bit of electricity, if you look at this larger chart, you'll notice that a lot of the devices that we at SVCE really want to push for our customers, like electric ovens, electric water and space heating, and more advanced L2 EV chargers have a much higher demand than even a window AC unit. So hopefully you can kind of start to think about, you know, how our electrification programs are potentially going to impact demand on the grid. And we're going to dig into more detail on that going forward. But first, let's back up and talk a little bit about some of these electricity system basics. So once again, this might be a refresher for a lot of you. Some of the materials might be new, so feel free to stop me as we go through. For folks who have had either the fortune or misfortune of sitting through an undergraduate or graduate level course in electricity markets and electricity policy, you might be familiar with the framework that we generally use to describe the electricity system. And so we normally break it out into 4 component parts. And so we'll talk about the generation portion of the system. And by that, we really mean the power plants, which can be hydroelectric, natural gas, renewables. The energy created at those generation plants is then transmitted through transmission and distribution lines, and ultimately reaches our load zones or our customers, where, you know, it's everything from somebody turning on the light in their living room to powering a large data center down in Silicon Valley. SVC fits into this picture sort of on either ends of the spectrum, right? So our power supply team is very involved in going out and procuring the clean energy resources that are created by these generation plants. So our funds flow in to finance the development of those plants. Depending upon our engagement with that contract, you know, with some of our PPAs, we actually have some control over how those plants bid into the CAISO market. So we'll talk about that in just a moment. That power gets transmitted through the PG&E grid. So we are, I guess you could say, less involved in the transmission and distribution part of the system. But then finally, it ultimately serves SVC's customers as load. And so that's where our ASKER team and our programs team do a lot of work to make sure that our customers are having the interactions with their energy provider, us, that they want to be having. So there's one, what I'll call fundamental rule of the grid that I want us to be thinking about as we go through our conversations today. So I'll come back to this quite a few times. And that's really that supply and demand on the grid must be balanced in real time every single moment of the day. So what that means in practice is that there's somebody sitting at the California ISO or CAISO in the control room, and they're literally looking at a screen right now and checking to make sure that the frequency of the grid is humming along at about 60 hertz. And if the frequency starts to get higher than that, it's telling the grid operator that there's too much supply on the system and they need to pull some of that supply offline. If it gets lower than that, demand is exceeding supply, and the grid operator has to be able to turn power plants on rapidly. And if the grid falls out of that sort of perfect balance, you can do a lot of damage to the underlying infrastructure. So that's why this is like the key thing that they're working on there. There's a couple of key takeaways I want us to keep in mind that's come as a result of this requirement or this fundamental rule. And first of all, it means that grid operators need flexible resources to balance the grid, right? You need to, in very rapid succession, be able to pull supply up or down in order to keep the grid in balance. The second implication of this is that the grid has to be built to meet peak demand, right? If you know that some hour in the summer, you're going to need 50,000 megawatts, or you'll have 50,000 megawatts of demand, you really need to have 50,000 megawatts of supply in that hour, because if you don't, you're going to get into the situation that the operator found themselves in 2020 when we had rolling blackouts, and you're going to have to forcibly shed some demand. Finally, there's a third takeaway that I think is maybe a little bit less obvious, but is an important one, which is that you'll notice that I was talking about the grid operator keeping this stuff in perfect balance all on the supply side, right? Turning power plants up and down. But you could just as easily, well, maybe not just as easily, but theoretically, you could also do this by doing demand side management as well. So we're going to talk about that a lot more later. If we're going to talk about, this fundamental rule of supply and demand being in balance, I want to touch really quickly on where supply and demand, or what the shapes of the supply and demand look like. So in California, we have, obviously a number of different customer types. We generally talk about residential customers, commercial customers, and industrial customers. But overall, the grid shape or the demand shape pretty closely follows what a residential shape looks like. And that's good because it actually makes it really easy for us to sort of imagine how demand fluctuates throughout the day, right? Because you can just think about your own usage. So you know that hopefully overnight you're fast asleep and you're not using a lot of power. Maybe in the morning you wake up and you're boiling water for coffee and it picks up a little bit. But most of your demand is probably occurring in the evening hours. Hopefully you're at home, you're cooking, preferably on an electric induction top stove. That's creating a lot of your demand. There's also a seasonal element to this, where in California, we tend to be a summer peaking system. So that also means that we use a lot more AC units in the late afternoons and evenings. And that has the effect of creating a much higher demand in the summer. On the supply side, there's a similar-ish thing going on, right? So we know that, of course, we have a lot of solar and wind on the system here in California. Obviously, that solar is only kicking on in the middle of the day. Wind has a relatively complementary profile, so it shows up in the evening hours. But nonetheless, today in California, we have what we'll call a fossil gap, and I'll refer to that a few times today. And what that really is the supply that the grid operator needs to meet demand in all of those other hours. And you'll notice it's significantly larger in the evening hours once the sun's gone down. So if we want to figure out how to really decarbonize the system, we have to think about how we can fill those fossil heavy hours with renewable resources. So really quickly want to highlight how SVCE engages with the market. We've touched on this a little bit already, but our power supply team is buying contracts and we are selling that energy into the California ISO. There's almost a separate simultaneous thing happening, which is the California ISO is taking all of the energy on the grid and it's providing it out to our customers. And we compensate the ISO for that energy that our customers need. And in turn, our customer pays us through their bills. But I think the important thing here is that it's almost two separate transactions happening. It all goes through our settlements team, but the energy that we put onto the grid, the actual electrons that we put onto the grid, are not the same electrons that our customers are pulling off. So with that, I want to quickly touch on one really core concept, and I apologize in advance because this slide by itself is sometimes a 2-hour lecture in classes, but I'll try to keep it high level and hopefully clear. And so the thing I want to talk about is how prices are set in the energy markets, because I want to key up some concepts around how SVCE makes money. And so the key concept here is that today energy, well, not just today, but in the California ISO and all the other independent system operators across the country, the market operator determines energy prices based on the most expensive unit needed for reliability at that particular moment. And so what that means in principle is that the grid operator takes all of the available resources at any one time, and it's going to stack rank them based on how expensive they are. And that grid operator will then basically crawl up the supply stack until supply and demand are equal. And so in this graphic down here, if the last unit that the grid operator needs to equal demand is this fourth gray dot, which is a combined cycle plant, the energy market will clear at $50. And every other resource that comes online, or that is online in that instance, will be paid $50 for their energy. A couple things to point out here. You'll notice that renewable resources have very low costs relative to fossil units. Hydro gets a little bit more expensive and then nuclear, but there's a big price difference between renewable resources, which produce, primarily in the middle of the day in California, and these fossil resources that are much more expensive. One key takeaway from that is that we know that there's a correlation between costs and how clean the grid is at a particular time. And it's actually a positive correlation, right? It's sort of what we want to see, the right economic incentives if we're a policymaker, which is that dirty power is really expensive and clean power is actually much less expensive. The other thing to bear in mind here is how we would view these prices as both a supplier and as somebody who is demanding energy from the system. So as a supplier, which SVC is, right, because we procure a lot of energy and sell it into the market, we want to sell cheap energy when prices are relatively high, right? We're going to maximize our revenue when we do that. Simultaneously, if you have demand or you're a load serving entity, you would like it if your customer's demand was primarily occurring in those low priced hours. And so because SVC is both a supplier and a load provider, we need to think about how we sort of maximize both ends of that equation. So that was a lot of information there. I do want to pause and see if there's any questions about what I just covered before I go into some key takeaways and jump to the next section.
Let's see, I see one hand raised. Thank you. I'm not sure who was first, so Rob Rennie and then Tina.
I just wanted to actually comment on there's actually even dirtier, there's different levels of dirty too on this. I think the top of the stack is actually turning on diesel generators, which not only produce carbon, they produce PM 2.5 particles, which are extra bad, right? So you've got both the greenhouse gases and you've got now, this significant health effects for asthma and other lung problems also. So I just wanted to add that comment.
Thank you. Director Leah.
Yeah, hi, thanks. So very quick question. When you're talking of managing the demand and the supply to balance that, does our behavior come into play? Because that's one of the challenge I personally face. As you pointed out, people get busy in the evenings doing a lot more household related tasks that consume a lot of energy. And so for that, what can we do at SVCE in terms of, do we incentivize behavior change? I mean, I want to change it. I'm struggling with that personally.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think we're going to probably answer it in a lot more detail in a couple sections here. But
Great.
I will say that, yes, there's absolutely things that our programs team is actively doing to try to think about how we can help our customers shift that demand.
Okay, thank you.
Vice Chair Tyson.
This might be a little too technical, but you initially said when the supply and balance aren't in sync that the frequency will vary plus or minus from 60 hertz. I always thought it was voltage. So is that right? It's this frequency that varies?
That's my understanding. I don't know if Nick or anyone else wants to chime in and correct me there, but yeah, I've always thought of it as the hertz.
They both change. Both change.
Both change.
Oh,
But to
okay.
keep the system stable, you're looking at 60 hertz, not just within our balancing authority, but between balancing authorities too. You have to keep the frequency, and it's never at 60.
Right.
It's 59.95, 99, and they keep track of the error, negative error, positive error to match. We'll capture that for a deeper dive. It's super exciting.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
sounds good.
Thank
All right.
you. I don't see any other questions, and I'm got everybody.
Perfect.
Good.
All right, so quickly before we start talking about some of these emerging trends, including how we can think about shaping our demand, I just want to summarize a couple of quick takeaways from this section, right? So once again, we know that supply and demand are going to fluctuate, but we have to keep them in balance. As Girish said, it's not always a perfect balance, but the grid operator tries to do the best they can. Second of all, we are one player in a larger ecosystem, so we're buying and selling our power through this centralized market. And then finally, and this is something I'll probably come back to many times, but we know that there is this fossil gap that is particularly pronounced in the evenings. And we really need to be thinking about how we can address that if we want to totally clean up the grid. So with that, I think we can jump to our second section, which is really on some of these key trends. At a high level, these are the three trends that we're going to talk about today: renewables and storage, resource retirements and reliability, and then what we'll call prosumers and electrification. Once again, I know that these are all concepts that you all have heard us talk about before, but the goal here is to talk about them in a little bit bigger picture, give context for where the grid is today, where SVCE's customers are today, and also talk about a little bit more where we think these trends are going to go and how they're going to impact the market and the regulatory space. Overlaying all of these trends is, of course, climate change. And of course, Silicon Valley's mission statement is really tied to the fact that we need to do what we can to help mitigate the impacts of climate change. But I think it's important to simultaneously acknowledge that climate change is already impacting the grid. So we know today climate change is impacting the ability of renewables and traditional resources in being able to deploy at all hours. The extreme heat waves are making it harder to retire resources and maintain reliability, especially as we have increased drought risk, bringing down our ability to rely on hydro. And then finally, we in general at SVCE, I think appropriately focus on the fact that electrification and having what we'll call prosumers or DER users is a good thing. I think it's also important to acknowledge that increasingly there's customers in California that are putting backup generation on their home sites or at their businesses because of risk of wildfires and PG&E's public safety power shutoffs. And basically their inability to have comfort that the grid is always going to be there when they need it. So with that, we can jump into our first topic, which is renewables and storage, we can, I think, first look back a little bit about where we've already come from. So over the past decade, the California ISO has added nearly 10,000 megawatts of utility scale storage or solar. So that's been our primary renewable that's come online. That's roughly 15% of the total system capacity. So it's a pretty dramatic change in a relatively short period of time. But we're actually projected to see a much more dramatic change over the next decade. So we expect to add roughly 20,000 megawatts of storage to the system. A lot of that storage is going to be paired with solar. So you can expect roughly another 20 to 25,000 megawatts of solar to accompany that storage. And when you think about where we are today, that's pretty remarkable because we have roughly 2,000 to 3,000 megawatts of storage on the system right now. And part of the reason I'm so sort of loosey-goosey about that number is because it's changing so dramatically that I bet if I had checked 6 months ago, it would have been 2,000 and it might already be at 3,000. Obviously, we know there's a lot going on with interconnection issues, but nonetheless, it's a very rapidly evolving number. And we know that that solar and wind and storage is going to have a huge impact on emissions reductions, but I also want to talk a little bit about how it's going to impact the economics of the market. But first, our second trivia question. So hopefully folks are ready for it. Fortunately, there's fewer options to pick from here. So the question is, after solar and wind, which renewable energy technology provided the most electricity to California in 2020? And our options are biofuels, hydrogen, renewable natural gas, geothermal, and small hydro. And I'll give you all a second to think about that. And the answer, hopefully some of you picked, is geothermal. Of course, you know we have quite a bit of geothermal in our own portfolio here at SVCE. But I also show this in part to give a sense of the total energy mix in California. So we have quite a bit of renewables. There's another big subset of resources we'll call carbon-free. So that's the large hydro and the nuclear fleet. But you'll notice that fossil fuel still takes up a very significant portion of our energy needs. And for reasons we'll get into in a little bit more detail in a moment, we still need some fossil to balance the grid, but there's probably sort of some future resources that we can utilize that provide the same attributes that the fossil fleet does. Before we jump into that, just a little bit more context on where we are and where we're going. So today, roughly 33% of California's energy needs are met by renewable or RPS resources. We know that by 2030, we have to get to at least 60% because that's what the state's RPS target is. And then of course, by 2045, because of SB 100, we would like to be at 100%. And the SB 100 target is not just for RPS, but also includes that large hydro and nuclear energy as well. Once again, that still gives a pretty big fossil gap that we need to address. So let's talk a little bit about how you can address that gap. So as a policymaker in California, and hopefully as a consumer of energy in California, I'm very focused on getting clean energy. But if I'm a grid operator, there's a couple other things I care about when I look at my resource pool. And so first of all, if I'm a grid operator, I really want firm resources, by which I mean resources that can reliably be counted on to show up when I need them. Second of all, at least some portion of my resource fleet needs to be flexible, right? I need to be able to turn them up and down to keep that supply and demand in balance. And then finally, and this might sound a little bit funny, but I want my resources to be energy providing. And the reason I bring that up is because I think it's really important to bear in mind that batteries are by themselves not creating any energy for the grid. And in fact, when you charge a battery, for about every megawatt hour of energy you put into it, you actually lose about 15% of that energy by the time it comes back out and serves customers. And that's one of the reasons why SVC has been really proactive in combining solar plus storage, because it ends up creating a resource that checks a lot of these boxes that a grid operator wants, right? It's clean, It's somewhat firm as long as you're able to charge it. It's flexible and it does provide energy. Obviously, fossil is not clean, but it does check all those other boxes that the grid operator wants. Then you get to this sort of what we'll refer to as firm, clean, and often we'll call them emerging technologies, even though some of them, like geothermal, are actually already proven technologies, which are in general clean, but have those firm and in some cases flexible attributes that the grid operator really needs. And unless we can get enough of those on the system, we can't retire all of our fossil and create and keep a reliable system. I'll pause again in just a moment, but any quick questions on this particular slide? I see Director Rennie.
Yeah, I have a question on the hydrogen. You got $3 signs there, and I assume that's because it's just still a young technology that could change quite a bit, right?
That's the working assumption. So the Department of Energy, the Federal Department of Energy, is in the midst of doing a lot to sort of subsidize the sector to ensure that they can bring down the cost of hydrogen. Hydrogen also can be charged off of dirty energy. So one of the goals is not just to get cheap hydrogen, but to make sure that you get cheap green hydrogen. And so that's one of the things that the DOE is focused on right now. But yeah, if you look at cost trajectories for hydrogen, they are expected to come down pretty significantly over the next few years.
And my understanding is right now in California, if you buy hydrogen, it's 2/3 made with fossil fuels. So it's not green at all, unless you can somehow get the certified green.
Yeah, I think most hydrogen, I believe the intent is that you are able to trace it and source it. But California currently doesn't have a set definition for what green hydrogen is. And I think that's something that the state needs to work out. I think there's increasing interest in sort of figuring out the standards for hydrogen in the state right now.
Director Flygore?
Thank you, Chair Gibbons, and thanks, Maren. Just a quick question on nuclear energy, and I think it may have been on the prior slide. What do you see as the future for nuclear energy in California? I know it's carbon free, but we also know it can be somewhat controversial. And so if you could just talk about that.
Yeah, I can share my personal view on that. And we'll talk about this a little bit in the next section, but certainly we all know that the Diablo Canyon power plant is retiring, and that's the last nuclear power plant that's actually in the state. A number of load serving entities have long-term contracts with a plant called Palo Verde. And so we will continue to get some nuclear energy into California after Diablo's gone, but Diablo is really sort of the end of nuclear here, at least for the time being. I think perceptions around nuclear are changing pretty rapidly. Certainly when the Diablo announcement was initially came out, there were a lot of people who were very happy to see it go. If you talk to folks who think about, how you can actually get to a fully decarbonized electricity sector, very few of them see good and affordable pathways that don't include nuclear. So it's a very tricky policy problem. There's a lot of work being done with what they call small modular reactors, or SMRs. And those are generally seen to be safer, in part because they're small, as the name implies. So we'll see where those technologies go, but certainly a very challenging industry with a lot of political history and a lot of strong feelings behind it. But I do think we're trending back towards potentially more interest in nuclear here in California.
Thank you. No other questions?
Okay. So one other quick point I want to talk about here on renewables before we jump to reliability, which is very much tied to the retirement of Diablo, is how renewables are impacting the energy markets. And so what this slide shows is essentially 3 versions of the world. And the first version we'll call our pre-solar world. So that's this blue dotted line here. And that in that world, essentially energy prices creep up throughout the day as demand increases and then fall off with demand. Where we are today in California is what we'll call a post-solar world. And that's where you get the famous California duck curve. So that's our green dotted line here. And what you see in this post-solar world is that in the overnight hours, you have fossil units setting the price. But in the middle of the day, when solar comes online, you can have it really driving our energy prices. So you get down in the middle of the day into the what we call the belly of the duck. And then prices rapidly increase in the evening as the sun goes down and the grid operator calls on relatively expensive but flexible resources to meet sort of that rapid climb through the neck of the duck. I think where we're going next, and I will say there's debate over how extreme this impact is on energy prices, but it's to what I'll call a post-storage world. And so here what you have is you've added, that 20,000 megawatts of storage to the system, and it increases demand dramatically in the middle of the day. So those storage units, the game that they're essentially playing is one of arbitrage, right? So you buy low, sell high. And so they're going to increase demand in the middle of the day when prices are low, which is in effect going to actually drive up the prices. And then they're going to sell in the evenings, which, because they're less expensive than those fossil resources, will bring prices down. So that has really important impacts, not just for storage, right, which is slowly basically eating away in some extent its own value, right, sort of cannibalizing its arbitrage. But it also has impacts for every other resource on the system, right, because we all are subject, or all these resources are subject to these same energy prices. So I wanted to point this out. I will note, and I'll sort of hit on this again in just a moment, but these are all issues that SVCE staff is already thinking about as we do our procurement and planning. We bear these issues in mind, but we really want to highlight these things for you all so you are aware of what we're thinking about when we bring new projects to you going forward. So throughout this presentation, I'm going to wrap up each section with some strategic issues. Once again, these are issues that Nick and I didn't pull these out of thin air. These are things that staff are already thinking about, but we really bring them to you today so that you hopefully have some context for why we're thinking about them, but also so you know a little bit more about what keeps us up at night. So when we think about these renewable resources, we need to be thinking about the fact that they're great, but they are going to change how the energy markets work going forward. And we need to be mindful of that when we sign long-term PPAs. We know that renewables like solar and wind are also doing a lot to help with emissions, but we need to be able to integrate them, by which we mean we need to give the grid operators all the tools they need to ensure that they can bring solar and wind on, but still balance the grid with other resources. And because we need those other resources, we also know that we need to continue to innovate in the sector and look for emerging technologies. So there's a question of, what does SVCE want to do to support and encourage these technologies coming online over the longer term? And once again, I'll pause here and see if there's any quick comments on this section. And also, I'm not sure, Nick, how we're doing for time. I think we might be a little bit behind, so maybe we can jump through questions, certainly. But I think Director Rennie?
I love graphs, and I was very intrigued by the post-solar, the post-storage portion line here, and how you actually have it up at about $20 per megawatt hour, probably is the post-storage. And I'm wondering, so the first thing I look at that and I say, well, geez, that's probably going to stimulate a lot more solar to be built if the price is really up that high. And I'm trying to work through in my mind whether that's really the price or you've somehow factored in the cost of adding storage to the price of it.
Yeah, so and maybe Nick, I'll have you chime in as well, because I know you put this graph together. I will say, I think these prices are somewhat illustrative. And I will also say there's a lot of debate over how much these curves are going to flatten, right? So there's a question of, do you get to the point where a storage unit is willing to come online if there's, $1 of arbitrage a day, or do they need much more than that? So I don't think we know quite where these are actually going to land.
And that's I think sort of what I'm trying to understand too, is most of that about the storage, or is there room there to stimulate solar because you're actually increase the demand so much during the day that it costs more to buy energy, which then, like I said, will stimulate even more solar to be built? Or am I not thinking about this correctly?
Yeah, I think that's a fair assumption that we're almost getting to the point, I shouldn't even say almost, we are at the point in California where we go into negative pricing events, or moments where some resources actually have to curtail energy. So we're producing more renewables than we can use. But certainly if you are building a lot of storage, it does create demand, which makes puts those resources back in the money again. The other point I'll make is, storage is sort of one part of this equation. If we really get down the road to green hydrogen is going to need a lot of renewable energy. I think this is a really back of the envelope number because the conversion's a little flimsy, but you need like roughly 2 megawatt hours to create 1 megawatt hour equivalent of hydrogen fuel. So it's just a remarkable amount of renewable energy that you would need if you really want to lean heavily on green hydrogen.
And Lauren, I'll just follow up on what you were talking to on this. I have affectionately talked about putting the duck curve on a diet. When you get into that negative pricing, bottoming out, meaning we're producing way too much solar that is not being utilized, right? The whole idea is to put it into batteries. That's what's causing the flattening out. And I think that's really important to understand, that why your 20,000 megawatts of solar battery storage is so important to understand, because we've got this capacity now, and if it's not being utilized, the prices go negative. We need to take advantage of the power being generated, and the only way to do that is through storage. So that's one of the reasons, as you said earlier, that storage is being combined with our solar projects. That relationship is really important to flatten the curve, get the duck on a diet, and then take advantage of the solar that's in storage in the times when it's cheaper than fossil fuel and reliable. Your term flexible is really important in this graph as well.
Liz, does that mean the frog won't be as good?
Well, depends in California or in Idaho. Okay, thanks. Sally, Director Meadows.
Yes, thank you. So I always so this is like capital S storage, the industrial scale. And then we have little s storage, where individuals may pair storage with their panels, and you touched on that earlier. But on the little s storage, if people have panels, does that influence this at all? Or is it purely an individual insurance policy against the reliability or lack thereof of the grid? I mean, should we be incenting? I mean, solar providers are still telling individuals that the prices for storage will come down. And so I think I know, again, a personal example, we put on panels but didn't put in the storage. So how does little s storage affect this, or does it not really?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it does have an effect. It's not as pronounced, right? Because those resources aren't operating in the market. But once again, because the supply and demand have to meet, if you are using your behind the meter storage every evening, which most people aren't, but if you were actually using that as your energy source in the evenings, you would effectively be bringing down the demand for the system. So you would, in your own little way, be helping to decrease energy prices. But yeah, you're not going to actually be subjected to these prices, right? So it's a little bit of a different story, but certainly still, you know, at scale could have an impact on these market forces.
And I think the comment is we are encouraging storage at the individual, you know, installation with solar and individual projects. We are encouraging, I think I'm correct on that we are encouraging localized storage. Yeah.
Absolutely. All right, so I didn't see any of their hands, so I'm gonna jump into our next section here. And this is really on resource retirements and reliability. So this topic has been very sort of a hot topic in policy for the last couple of years now, really ever since the 2020 rolling blackouts. And so we have a number of sort of forces at play here, right? First of all, we know in California, there's a desire to retire fossil units. We know, as we were just discussing, the last nuclear power plant's going to retire, and that there's also some hydro units that need to retire, but also just a problem with relying on hydro units as much as we have in the past. This story is not unique to California, though. We know throughout the West, there's a big push to retire, especially the coal plants, right? We don't have really any coal left in California, but it's very prominent throughout the rest of the Western interconnect. And those are the folks that we are importing power from. So when they retire units, it's impacting, you know, how much excess energy they have that they can sell to us. So even those forces outside of the state have a big impact on us. And once again, we'll talk a little bit more about how all of these retirements and reliability concerns are impacting policymakers and how they're thinking about resources going forward. But first, one more trivia. Well, actually, there's two more trivia questions. But our next trivia question, hopefully you're all still playing along at home, is since 2000, what percentage of California's in-state natural gas fleet has been retired? A, 100%. If you've been paying attention, hopefully you don't select that one. B, 85%, C, 65%, D, 35%, E, 15%, or F, 0%. Give you just a second to make a guess there, and then we'll jump to the answer here. So the answer is 35%. So since 2000, California's retired roughly 12 gigawatts of natural gas capacity, which is roughly enough to meet about a quarter of our peak day. But we still have 40 gigawatts on the system. So there's a lot more work to do if we really want to fully decarbonize the grid here. And so that last number I gave you, which I think was 12 gigawatts, was 2000 to 2020. If you look just at the last decade, we've retired about 11 gigawatts of fossil and nuclear capacity because SoCal Edison's nuclear power plant was retired in the last decade. But this graphic on the left here looks at how much more we want to retire in just the next 3 years, which if you're a grid planner, 3 years is an incredibly short time horizon. So we're going to retire 6.2 gigawatts. That includes what we call the OTC, or the once through cooling fossil plants. And it also, of course, includes Diablo Canyon. And as we mentioned earlier, there's a lot more capacity retiring across the entire Western interconnect. On top of this story of all the retirements we're trying to deal with, we also know there's a huge amount of drought risk. And this is certainly true for California, but once again, it spreads across the entire West. So when I check the numbers, as of April 1, we're at 38% of our average snowpack here in California right now. Fortunately, we import a lot of hydro from the Pacific Northwest, and this year it's looking okay there. I think it's closer to 95% of average, but we certainly know that with the increased risks of mega droughts, we can't reliably assume that that hydro capacity is going to be there going forward into the future. So all of these concerns have kind of come together. Like I said, a lot of this stemmed from 2020 and made reliability sort of the hot topic in the regulatory space. So as a system planner, you actually always have to have some tolerance for a reliability event or a blackout event, right? You don't want to build so much capacity that you're never ever going to lose power. But as one of our colleagues at another CCA said a couple months ago, even though maybe as a system planner you have some tolerance, the real tolerance for a reliability event is 0 times in any one governor's term, right? So what happened was Governor Newsom got a huge amount of pushback in 2020 when the blackouts occurred. And a lot of that strain has been pushed onto our regulators, who in turn have pushed a lot of it onto LSEs and demanded that we do something to ensure that this doesn't happen again. And so we've already seen that really pop up in a number of regulatory proceedings. So we know in the integrated resource planning proceeding, the CPUC's ordered almost 15,000 megawatts of new capacity. It's not bad in and itself that there's capacity being ordered in the IRP. That's part of the proceeding. The issue is that because it's been done under emergency conditions, the CPUC has ordered all LSEs to do that procurement, regardless of whether or not we needed it for our actual portfolio. The sort of next big space where this reliability concern has popped up has been in the resource adequacy proceeding. So currently, and for the last 20 years, LSEs have been required to show that they have adequate capacity under contract to meet their peak demand. However, after 2020, we've completely revamped that system and said, instead of just needing to show for your one peak hour, you're now going to have to show that you have enough capacity for every hour of the day. So a pretty radical reimagining of capacity requirements. And while those are sort of the two big showcase policy or regulatory proceedings I could think of, we know that there's also a big pool of future risks, right? So there's a lot of risk around the CPUC, the CAISO, or the CEC changing their resource counting standards going forward. And so that might impact how we're able to count our imports and hydro for all of our requirements. And further, the just general concerns around reliability might cause those agencies to look closer and be more conservative in how they count other resources, such as solar and storage hybrids. Once again, these are all concepts that our portfolio team is thinking about when we make procurement decisions, but just want to highlight for you all. So I'll quickly walk through a couple of strategic issues and then pause again. So first of all, SVCE, of course, is already procuring a lot of resources that do help reliability. Our 4-hour storage does some good, certainly, but the geothermal and the LDS, the long duration storage, is really what makes our regulators happy to see us procure. We know that we need to help continue to procure these firm and flexible resources to displace the grid's need on for natural gas. And I think we also may want to start thinking about how we contract hydroelectricity and how much we want to rely on that going forward. So I will pause there again and see if there's any thoughts from the board or Monica or Nick or Girish.
Director Locke.
Yeah, thank you. I have a question about retirements and how to think about it, because I can imagine two different ways of thinking about retiring, say, natural gas plants. And one is to retire, get them entirely off the grid, just take them out, retire them completely. The other is to reduce how much we're using them. And so they could still be around for, say, backup purposes or that last few percentages of times that we need them. And in doing that, we have greatly reduced our carbon footprint from these fossil sources, but they're still available. So help me with how to think about retirements and like what our policy direction should focus on.
Yeah, I think that's a great question and a really good point. So I think the concern that people have with keeping a lot of natural gas on the system is that if I'm a developer, if I own a power plant, I need to make back all of my money, right? And so when I turn my power plant on, and this is getting into a little bit of maybe Energy 201, so I kind of sidestepped this topic earlier, but the money that we retrieve in the energy markets in general is intended to cover our fuel costs and our variable O&M costs. It doesn't cover the ongoing capital expenses for the units. And so you need to capture that somewhere else. And you can do it through the Resource Adequacy Capacity Program. But if you're not utilizing those units very often, the cost of just having them sitting idle gets to be very expensive. And so there's probably some sort of break-even analysis of, how much do we want to retain for those reliability purposes, but at some point, even more expensive units that are utilized more often are going to be less costly overall. One other way of thinking about it, and this is something that I think PG&E actually recently announced they're going to start doing, is they're going to put additional renewable natural gas into their gas blend. So that's one way to reduce emissions, but still use the plants pretty regularly. And you can do a similar thing with hydrogen, right? So a big question right now in the technology space is how much hydrogen can we blend into natural gas safely? And so that's one way where you could bring down emissions, but still utilize the plants enough that it's economic to keep them online at all. Does that help a bit? I know that's kind of a complicated answer. But.
Yeah, that does help. I mean, I realize it's a nuanced, layered issue, yeah, that gives me some other aspects to think about there. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a topic that I think is going to be one of the sort of policy topics in the broader IRP proceeding this next time. So likely to come up in the regulatory space, and it might be a good topic for this group to talk about in more detail going forward as well.
Yeah, and I guess just to follow on, one other thought I had is that if we completely get rid of the natural gas facilities, then we also need to think about what replaces them and what the cost of that is. And I know just in my experience in other industries, sometimes you can get 98% of the way there, and that last 1 or 2% is really hard to get rid of and very expensive to get rid of. But getting 98%, you can get there much more effectively. And so is it worth us trying to get that last 1 or 2%? How much do we focus on that? So anyway, not expecting an answer now, but that's another piece of it for me.
Yeah, I think that's a very big question. So in the SB 100 studies that they've done so far, they've run a number of different scenarios, and they've tried to look at that, right? Like, what does it cost? What sort of build out do we need for low combustion versus no combustion? And the build out, I don't remember exactly, but it's pretty significant how much additional capacity you need to build if you have zero tolerance for any gas on your system at all.
So I'm just going to put a thought out there, not necessarily to be answered, but I think a relevant thought. Our mission statement is to decarbonize, to directly address climate change, and the infrastructure for any fossil fuel system has the intrinsic leakage that is devastating to our climate. So while we're thinking of retirements, the retirements also filter into the distribution of that fossil fuel as well as the. So I think that's going to be consideration also in how we look at different future contracts.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. All right, if there's no other questions right now, we can jump to our last big topic area here, which is prosumers and electrification. So I should clarify before I jump in what I mean when I say prosumer, because it's not necessarily a super standard term. But really what I'm talking about here is a consumer of a product that actually, in their very nature of consuming the product, they help us think about how to design and develop either a product or a service. So when our programs team is launching all of these pilot projects and they're getting a lot of data back from our customers, really those customers are effectively prosumers who are helping us think about how to shape projects as we expand them going forward and really bring them to scale. So we know that California is in a lot of ways on the leading edge of technological innovation. We have over 1 million EVs in the state. Certainly Silicon Valley has more than its fair share of those. And we also know that there's a big push at SVCE to electrify space and water heating. And that, as we sort of hinted at throughout today, that can have a really big impact in increases to demand. But what we want to highlight in part in this section is how that new demand can be shaped to help support the grid going forward. But first we have one more, and I promise this is the last one, trivia question. So this is a fill in the blank. And the question is, electric vehicles support less carbon dioxide than gasoline cars unless the energy source is blank. A, the US grid, B, a natural gas power plant, C, the California grid, D, coal power, or E, biomass. I'll give you just a second to think on this one. And the answer here is that it's actually a trick question. You can thank Nick for that. He put all the trivia together. So if you don't like the trick question, we'll put it on him. But I do appreciate Nick doing all the trivia for us today. I was surprised by this myself. I really thought that if you figured out a way to plug your EV directly into a coal plant, it was going to be dirtier than a gasoline powered car. But rather shockingly, driving a gasoline or an internal combustion engine vehicle, 100 miles, you're almost certainly going to release more CO2, or actually on average, you'll release more CO2 than even if you're charging from a coal power plant. And then of course that gets progressively cleaner. The US grid is significantly cleaner than solely coal, California cleaner than that. And then of course, SVCE's resource mix is really just about 100% clean. So before we get too much more into where SVCE is today with our customers and our programs, I wanted to back up a little bit and talk about emissions across the economy. Because while I recognize that SVCE's mission statement, talks about clean electricity, we also mentioned our innovative programs targeted towards our community. And I think in general, when you think about what these programs are really aiming to do, they're trying to figure out how you take energy demand from sectors like commercial and the transportation sectors and move that energy demand, which is generally, gas, into the electricity sector, which is much cleaner. And the sort of interesting thing here is how much we've been able to clean up the electricity sector over the last 20 years. So what we want to do is take our community's demand for whatever energy it is, move it into electricity demand, which is less GHG intensive. And of course, we can continue to clean up the electricity sector as we go forward as well and bring the whole GHG curve down even more. So let's talk a little bit about where we are today. And I should be very transparent here and admit that the numbers on this graphic are a little bit out of date. So hopefully they're even better than this. But today, roughly 35% of the emissions in the SVCE territory are estimated to come from vehicles. An additional 25% we estimate come from space and water heating. So there's a lot of work to do in those sectors still. And one of the challenges that our programs team face is that even though, in many instances, the electric alternative is, at least in our view, better than what they are using today, there's a lot of barriers to entry for our customers and a lot of consumer preferences that you have to get over, right? So people, right or wrong, like having their gas cooking and have some concerns about switching to induction. EVs are great, but a lot of folks have range anxiety and don't want to be halfway to Tahoe and find that their cars run out of charge. So those are the types of issues that, when you're working on the demand side, are really important to tackle. One way that Silicon Valley Clean Energy has done a really good way of doing that is by making it a lot easier to deal with it, by making sure that from the get-go, people have a all electric house that they can turn to. So that's really what the Reach Codes program has been all about. I think it's been a really shining example of what SVCE has done. So I didn't want to be too disparaging with my, previous comments that we had a lot of emissions still in those other sectors, because we're definitely doing a lot of good work there. And on that point, we talked a little bit about what our behind the meter solar customer profiles look like before, but SVCE does have roughly 25,000 customers that have behind the meter solar. And that's a great thing, right? All of those customers in the middle of the day are creating clean energy for their own use. In addition to those 25,000, we have roughly another 2,600 customers that have installed both rooftop solar and behind the meter storage. And so that behind the meter storage can be used just for sort of emergency reliability purposes, but customers should also have the option to use that energy in the evenings to help ensure that their energy usage is cleaner. And as we'll talk about in a little bit, they also are helping the entire grid by bringing down that peak demand in the evening. And of course, our programs team is already working really hard to think through policy options and technical strategies to get more customers to adopt both technologies. And while behind the meter storage, solar and storage, but mostly behind the meter solar is kind of a big flashy thing, right? You see it on your neighbor's roof, you know that they're helping contribute to a green grid. I also wanted to touch base quickly on energy efficiency and demand response. So California has actually been leading in energy efficiency for a very long time, relative to what sort of would have otherwise been the case. Our total energy or electricity demand is actually 33% less in the state than we would have expected if we hadn't taken the steps we did early on to encourage energy efficiency. And well, as this slide says, the most efficient kilowatt hour is one you never have to use. It also matters a lot when you defer that demand. So I want to walk through one last quick example to really drive home what I mean by all of that. But first, let's just walk through what we'll call the prosumer value chains, right? So one, it's great to have our customers have these distributed energy resources because they are lower emissions than fossil-based alternatives. Second of all, electrification is really good for SVCE in general, right? It increases our demand, which allows us to spread our fixed costs across a wider range of kilowatt hours, and also creates additional revenue that we can then reinvest in programs and customer savings. DERs by themselves decrease demand from the grid, but once again, they only add sort of value to the total system costs if they can be utilized during that peak hour. So once again, you have to build the grid to the peak. And that's why smart electrification is really so important. So let me sort of try to walk you through this graphic on the bottom here. So what we're seeing here is that the blue columns are representative of some load serving entities' baseline load shape. And so you see that it peaks in the afternoon or in the evening. And this red line here is indicative of the CAISO market prices. So what you see is that, as would make sense, prices are high when demand is high. But what we can try to do through our programs team and all of the various activities and programs I can put together is really build this post-electrification demand shape. And you'll have to trust me on the math a little bit here, because I don't know if it's super obvious from the columns. But if you were to actually look at the numbers underlying this, the total load is higher in the green columns, but the total cost that SVCE is paying for that energy is less. And as you can probably infer by now, that's because we've taken demand out of those evening hours and we've pushed it into the middle of the day. And there's a number of ways we could have done that, right? So one, the customer might be using their behind the meter storage in those hours. Perhaps they have, smart appliances, so their AC unit pre-cooled their house, which would increase demand in the middle of the day and reduce it in the evenings. Maybe their EV is now charging in the middle of the day instead of when they first plug it in. And then also some of this can just be done with good old time of use rates, right? If you know that you're subjected to different prices throughout the day and you're a price sensitive customer, you're going to go ahead and you're going to try to do as much as you can, in the middle of the day and try to reduce your demand in the evenings. So little price signals can even be effective in this space. So with this, we'll come to our last slide on strategic issues. I know I've been talking a lot, promise I'm almost done here. And once again, I want to reiterate that these are not like new strategic issues that, Nick and I came up with. These are things that the programs team spends a lot of time thinking about. But one is, yes, how can we support our customers and encourage them to use their electrification and distributed resources in a way that not only benefits them, but also benefits the entire grid? Second is one where I think SVC has really done a great job. I've only been with this organization 10 months, and I really appreciate the fact that we focus on equity issues. And so I know it's built into really all of our programs, but I think it's really important to continue thinking about that, especially as we start thinking about how to transition away from the natural gas system going forward. And then finally, and this is kind of a big topic, Nick and I went back and forth a little bit on whether or not we even wanted to broach this subject. But thinking back a few slides ago where we looked at sector-wide or economy-wide emissions, right? SVCE at some point, our focus to date has really been on making sure that we're getting the electricity sector clean. And there's a lot of good reasons for that, right? It's great that we have carbon-free electricity on an annual basis. We're meeting all of our obligations in MTR and RPS requirements. But I don't even want to say at some point, but we need to think about the balance between, how much do you go all in on a clean electricity sector versus, to what extent do you want to direct funds to help bring down emissions in some of those other sectors as well. So that's a big topic, but one that I think is worth discussing with the board further going into the future. So I'll pause there once again. I only have a few more minutes on IRP, and then we'll also pause for a larger discussion. I see Director Rennie, you have your hand up.
I wanted to bring up the DER, the distributed energy resources, which are really, people, solar on people's roofs and maybe other small sources like that. And we keep looking at it from an energy provider's perspective, but I think we need to look at it from the grid's perspective also, the transmission distribution. As we try to electrify things, we're going to need to upgrade our grid if we have to deliver a lot more electricity. But if you have a lot of DER resources, that now, it could do two things. It means you have more electricity going both directions, which parts of the grid weren't designed for. So you may need to upgrade there. But then on the other hand, it may save money in other and transmission potentially, or maybe other parts of the distribution grid. So I think that DER is good from the whole cost perspective. when we think about trying to do a lot more electrification.
Yep, I absolutely agree. I will say one of the things, I came from a system planning background, and one of the things that's really been shocking to me is how little distribution planners and system planners communicate with one another. So I think there's a growing acknowledgement that we need to think about this a little bit more holistically.
Thank you. And Maren, I am going to bring up the elephant in the room, PG&E. And I'm just curious, so when we talk about grid reliability, obviously PG&E has a huge role to play there. And I'm just curious if you could talk about what you're hearing about what they see as the future to ensure reliability. And is anything that we as CCAs are proposing or the regulatory entities that PG&E would be opposed to, or are we all aligned, PG&E, the regulatory entities and CCAs, on how we move forward to ensure grid reliability? Because I imagine it's a win-win for everybody.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And maybe I'll preface my answer by saying 11 months ago, I was a PG&E employee, so I'll try to be, nuanced in my response here. But I think you're right. Everybody is concerned about this. I sort of joked that the regulators, pushing the reliability issue onto us, but reliability is a huge concern. It's an inconvenience to most of us when our power goes out and our ice cream melts. But there are a lot of people across the state who have medical devices, and it's life-threatening when their power goes out. And I think PG&E and the government and the agencies and the CCAs all recognize that. It's a frustrating situation for all of us. I think it's easy to look at PG&E and say that they're maybe being swung the pendulum pretty far and now are being almost too conservative sometimes, and when they shut off the power, and obviously that creates a lot of problems for our customers. But the risk of wildfire is massive, and I'm sympathetic to the fact that PG&E needs to sometimes do that, and I think the state and a number of entities are working together to try to think that problem through and how to strike the right balance there. But I do think folks are pretty aligned in the goals that they have in that space overall. And I know there's a number of proceedings going on at the CPUC trying to address wildfire planning and things of that nature, and the CCAs are certainly involved in that space. I don't know if that covered all of the facets of that question, but happy to do follow-ups as well.
No, it sounds like you're saying we're all aligned and consistent with our approach moving forward. There's nothing inconsistent where PG&E may be heading in one direction for self-interest that doesn't align with what the regulatory agencies and the CCA, since they're pushing it down on us to figure out.
Yeah, maybe the extra little bit of nuance there, right? I think PG&E is very mindful of the potential liability if there is another wildfire. And so the question is, have we found that right balance between risk and the safety of our customers and the grid? So, and the one other thing I say, my take on it is that there's still certainly room for improvement with communications between PG&E and the CCAs there. And that might be one where Girish or Monica could speak a little bit more to our experience last summer with some of the, I don't know if they're PSPS events, but I know there's some grid reliability and sort of flex events that were called. And we had a pretty strong communications team working on how to, voice all those concerns to our customers. So probably communications is still an area where there's some room for improvement.
I just add just for a few seconds, I think this is a very big question, Director Flegor, that we can probably tee up for another workshop. I think your question's very good. And I think alignment of interests for the most part are good, at least I'd say in the short term. But in the long term, especially as you think about what Maren just presented on. As these devices, whether it's solar, storage, EVs, increase by a factor of 10x, what does the grid look like? And are we aligned there? I'm not sure we are. And I think there are some proceedings talking about that. So it's a great question. And it is being addressed by the PUC. And we are part of that proceeding too, with PG&E and a variety of interests that gets, and we'll tee it up as a follow-up item.
And it's perhaps related to this, I was very surprised when we did the Reach 1.0 that PG&E's president at the time sent every city a letter saying, yes, we want you to go all electric. And I think that's an important understanding when we're talking about fossil fuels and reliability. That PG&E, I understand, wants really to shut down their fossil fuel plants to some extent because they are becoming more costly to operate. They are becoming more costly because of the infrastructure, but also because of the cost of the fuel itself. So I think that's in thinking about what our future is going to be and what the marketplace is and where we're going to be looking for, I think we have to accept that the environment is going to be changing. Exactly what Director Flyber said is how does PG&E fit into this?
Yeah, and maybe just to toss out one more thing that we could maybe have a whole other conversation about, of course, is just the transition away from gas infrastructure altogether, right? PG&E is very concerned with, sort of spotty random electrification. And actually, I think to Chair Gibbons' point, they're very supportive of citywide electrification because it's going to help them prune that system down in a way that's much more economic for all of our customers. And my understanding is that there has been a lot of very productive conversations between the CCAs and PG&E and how to move that forward.
Great. So it is now 2:30. How are we doing on our timing? What would you like to do next, Maren? Nick?
I think we're doing pretty good. I am going to very quickly run through a little bit about our IRP, and then I'll be done and we can open this all up for conversation. Hopefully this will take less than 5 minutes. Like I said at the outset, one of the impetuses for this workshop was really the fact that we knew our integrated resource planning plan was coming up this year. And so what hopefully I'll be able to explain in the next few minutes is that a lot of these topics that we've discussed today really filter into the CPUC's IRP process. So I know for some of you, it's been 2 years since you've had to sort of go through the SVCE IRP process. Some folks might be new to it. So I wanted to take a quick moment to talk about what the IRP process is and why it exists. And then I'll talk a little bit about what SVCE plans to do this cycle. So as I mentioned, the IRP is really the proceeding in which the CPUC looks and tries to address system planning issues. So every 2 years, every CPUC jurisdictional LSE will file what we call an individual IRP. And that's essentially a number of Excel data templates and a very long narrative in which we explain how out to 2035, we're going to meet all of our obligations, energy, climate obligations, resource adequacy needs. And in that narrative, we'll also discuss our sort of key planning issues, including our programs and procurement efforts, and what we intend to procure to meet those requirements. Once we file those, the CPUC is going to take all 50 or so LSE's IRPs, and they stitch them together into what they call the preferred system plan. That plan then gets put through a number of models and analysis is done to ensure that the combined plan of all the LSEs is sufficient to meet our reliability and climate targets, ensure that we have the system that we need going forward. Now, ideally at the end of this cycle, though traditionally has happened in the middle because of the reliability concerns that we talked about previously, the CPUC will order new capacity. And they'll order that capacity if their system doesn't meet the requirements that they've laid out. In some instances, if they've changed the requirements partway through the cycle, they'll meet it if they don't trust that LSEs are going to procure to the plans they filed. And in some cases, they'll also order capacity for specific resources, right? So what we saw with the midterm reliability order was that there is geothermal and long duration storage carve-outs. I strongly suspect that at the conclusion of the 2022 cycle, there will be an order for offshore wind. So with that, we can talk a little bit about the 2022 cycle very quickly. So SVCE is going to file our next IRP on November 1st, 2022. We will be required to file for what we call 2 portfolios. So portfolio being, our version of how we're going to meet a specific GHG target. And so those 2 portfolios are one, what we'll call a 30 MMT or million metric ton GHG target by 2035. And then there will be a 25 million metric ton target. So those are the system targets, and we're given a much smaller share of that based largely on our load. SVCE has the option, but not the obligation, to provide additional preferred portfolios. Before I get into that, I'll just summarize really quickly that the final requirements are supposed to come out sometime next week. So we don't know exactly what we're going to be required to file, but it should look roughly like what we saw in the last 2 cycles. And then finally, as I mentioned previously, I do expect that there's likely to be additional procurement ordered at the end of this cycle, and I expect it to be an offshore wind carve-out. So our current thinking is that SVCE is just going to file the 2 required portfolios. The rationale for that is essentially that even though there's maybe a temptation to file something much more aggressive, maybe a 10 MMT sort of system target or something like that. And while SVCE does want to be ambitious in our climate planning efforts, there's a lot of regulatory uncertainty in the IRP right now. And so I think there's some risk that if we put forth a very aggressive preferred plan and the CPUC says, great, we expect you to go out and procure that, they could also then come back and say, but we're still going to give you a load share allocation of this offshore wind. And so we're trying to avoid that. I think if we want to do additional planning with different targets, that's definitely something we should pursue, but it might not make it into our filing. We might put it off until after November 1st. And the other benefit of doing that is if we do it internally, we're not going to be bound to the tools that the CPUC puts out, right? They have a certain set of tools and templates that you have to file to, and they're really quite restrictive, and we won't necessarily agree with all of the assumptions that go into them. So that's where we are with the IRP right now. Our plan is to come back to you all in August with a draft IRP, and then that will be approved, hopefully approved by the board in October in time for the November filing. So with that, I think we've gotten through everything I was hoping to chat about today. Certainly, definitely want to have a conversation and discussion on any of the topics. And as we mentioned at the outset, perhaps establish some additional next steps and talking points. But with that, I'll turn it back over to Chair Gibbons and Girish to help lead us through this discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Nick. It's very helpful to have this kind of information, refreshing, but also connecting it to the future and what's coming up before it. So that was very helpful. Do we have some questions? I don't see any hands raised. I thought you have a lot of good little bullets on the bottoms of several of the slides. And I think when we're looking to the future, what it is that what is it that the focus of the board's decisions and direction of the staff are going to be in the way of power? There's still a tremendous amount of fossil fuel power being needed. So what is the thought about how how we can address or focus on reducing the fossil fuel. What kind of programs, what are we going to be looking at in the way of programs and contracts to reduce the fossil fuel?
Yeah, so I can start, and then Monica, I'm sure you'll have more to chip in here. So I think a number of you had the chance to meet our summer intern Ethan during the board meeting on Wednesday. So a lot of his projects this summer is really thinking about what sorts of portfolios can get you to what we'll call a 24/7 carbon free, where instead of just an annual GHG free portfolio, you're actually meeting your load, your demand and supply as an LSE are being met in all hours, and it's being met entirely with clean energy. So he's looking at, what that would take. I think there's a number of steps in between, where we are today and that. Certainly, I think continuing to think through, some of those firm, clean resources and emerging technologies to help offset those evening hours is going to be really important for us. But yeah, Monica, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think Chair Gibbons, you realize, because you've been here since the beginning, that we've layered in quite a bit of clean resources that'll help us get to that 24/7 sooner probably than many other CCAs, with the inclusion of wind, geothermal, which is a firm clean resource, and a whole lot of storage paired with our solar. So I think the real challenges is going to be kind of those last few megawatts, those last few hours, where we just don't have enough resources, and it doesn't make sense for us to do another big geothermal contract or another big solar plus storage contract, because we'll have a lot of hours where we exceed what we need in clean energy. So the challenge is going to be to see what other types of resources or tools could we use, including a virtual power plant. There's the idea of using offsets, procuring very shaped products in the market that only deliver during certain hours, or putting a lot more standalone storage into our portfolio that we could use and dispatch in those hours where we still have exposure to not clean energy from the grid. So I think that's the real challenge. It's not so much to help build the foundation of a clean portfolio, but how to get those last few hours cleaned up.
So one of the other, what you just said kind of triggered the other question, so other side of the question for me, which is we talk about clean and we talk about renewable and we talk about hydro. One of the things that I think to meet our 24/7 intent with the caveats that you just spoke to is what kind of energy do we want to utilize in our portfolio? Do we want to continue to contract with new renewable sources versus relying on hydro, particularly large hydro? Certainly we know that with the drought, it's reliability. But what other kinds of I think, tough questions do we need in our portfolio to ask about what portfolio we want to do in our IRP planning?
Yeah, I think because we have multiple objectives when developing a portfolio, whether it's for the IRP or for whatever reason, our objectives are obviously to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That's in our mission. But also we have this objective to be reliable and to help support the grid and reliability efforts, and then to be affordable. And affordability is an important one. And affordability really comes in two ways, like what does it cost us to procure that resource? And what do we think the value of that resource is going to be in the market over a long period of time? Because these are like 20-year contracts, right? And then a risk management issue, like how does this particular resource meet our overall risk management requirements or policies, whether it's to provide a hedge or just to reduce risk or to diversify the portfolio. And so one of the things that we're very much learning, as you're all well aware, is that new resources carry a lot of development risk. So, that it takes some time to come on. You really have to have a good partner in those developments, and market conditions have to be such that those resources can come on as expected. And so to manage some of that portfolio or that development risk, we need a good balance of existing resources and new resources so that we're not always reliant on building these new projects and bringing them online. And that also feeds into kind of another risk that we have, which is, direct access. So we always have this risk that we can lose our load. And so we don't want to over procure long-term resources from new projects, because if we lose our load, then those resources are still ours and we still have obligations. So that's why we do a mix of new and existing short-term products and long-term products so that we can really manage that portfolio risk.
That makes a lot of sense. I see some other hands. I'll go to Director Lee.
Thank you. I guess this might be a dumb question. Somebody might have addressed already, but in case it's not, regarding the issue of procuring too much energy, and that is, since we are currently buying it at pretty low prices, as we are looking at the price of energy has gone up so much, can we actually sell the cheaper energy and actually make a profit out of this work when we have too much energy that we don't need to use, or is that not allowed?
So just as Marin explained in I think the first module,
yes,
we operate within what's called the Cal ISO. So every megawatt hour that we have rights to, that we've contracted for, we sell that into the ISO, whether it's to meet our load or whether our load needs it or not. So we get paid for every single megawatt hour that we have under contract. Whether we sell that megawatt hour at a loss or at a profit relative to what we've paid for it is very much dependent on what the market price is in that hour that we put it into the ISO. But yes, we have the ability to sell we have to sell all of our resources into the ISO.
But if I may clarify, Director Lee, we don't sell it to another provider. We sell it into the grid, into the Cal ISO. All of it goes in there.
right. So, and then that's the case, like you said, if we resell it in the evening, that's when the price is higher, we'll be able to be profitable. But if we sell it during the day, that's when we potentially could lose money, right?
Right. And if we have a lot of solar, we have to sell it into the day unless we have storage to put it into the battery to sell it at night.
Great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Right. And then second question I have is, I'm not sure if I think it might have addressed in the early module as well, regarding the Diablo Canyon. There have been some movement or discussion about maybe delaying the closure of it past 2025. Is there any truth to that, or is that still under discussion?
The last I heard is it's still under discussion. I know the governor has come out and said that he would like PG&E to explore extending the timeline for Diablo Canyon. He's asked the federal government to make some clarifications for some of the resources or some of the funds they've set aside for nuclear subsidies, to clarify that those could be used for Diablo Canyon. So there's certainly a push from Newsom's office. I think it's last I've heard, it's still unclear whether or not PG&E is going to pursue that route. The last time I heard word from senior executives at PG&E talk about it, they said that it would literally take an act of Congress to keep it open. And the reason for that is that you have a license to operate a nuclear facility. And in order for PG&E's license to get renewed, it's going to have to be fast-tracked in a way that's going to be very difficult, but given the reliability concerns in California, perhaps not impossible. So I think that's one to stay tuned on.
Is this something that this board has ever taken a position on? Whatever would prefer to have it extended due to these other issues that we're facing?
I'll just speak to that. No, the board has not. It's a very new issue. We have talked about nuclear a few years ago when we recommended and the board approved us taking nuclear allocation credits. that has saved us some money. And at the last board meeting, you approved uh, spending the savings we accrued from that. In this case, was $1.9 million for various community programs.
Thank you, Girish. And I guess this is something that I think is, given how new it is, but how in a way urgent, already 2022, and of course getting these things extended would take a while. So if it's something that's worthwhile for us to put in our future agenda to discuss, I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Lee. Director Rennie?
So I wanted to bring up something else, but I'll comment on that quickly. Yeah, I think we do need to extend the nuclear power plant. Isn't it running about 20% of the load? It's some large number, right? That's going to have to be replaced. And we're already having trouble with our peak loads, right? To then lose that. I would be a little bit disappointed if they used the subsidies on it, because I was under the impression the subsidies are to stimulate the new type of nuclear that you mentioned. But what I really wanted to bring up was the virtual power plant. It refers to really load control, right? When the load is. And it seems to me that that's something we really should be pushing harder, because it helps shave that peak that we're having trouble with. You know what, I've been out campaigning, so I talked to a lot of people, and you know, when there's threats of blackouts or rolling brownouts, whatever you want to call them, this summer, you know, that people start thinking, okay, well, why should I encourage electrification? It's just going to cause more problems, right? Why do I want more electric cars? Why do I want my, you know, all the things that we want to do get tied back to this problem when there's not enough power. And so that seems like it's, if we could more broadly expand controls of load, we could control that peak that needs so much power procurement. You talked about earlier, you know, they were requiring us to procure more than we actually need in order to make sure there's something available for these peaks, right? So it's costing us there. It's costing us in the friction that we're seeing to try to electrify things. So it seems to me that's an area that really could be powerful if we could push it forward, and be even more useful as more things are electrified, right? As more people have electric cars, but there's more programs to make sure the electric car, you know, you come home and you want to plug it in and then have it charge, you know, whenever the right time is without having to think about it. More of those programs, and we have some of those, but the expansion of those kinds of things seems like it's really tied, it's critical to helping move forward the whole electrification of everything.
Very good comments. Any thoughts? Reach?
Maren, do you want to address that?
To me, just to segue into it, it ties right into what Maren was saying, which is how do we want to spend our money? How do we want to prioritize where we get the best advantage for our organization effort? And certainly the negative press that Director Rennie was talking about the why should we go more electric when it's just going to put a greater demand on the grid and the grid can't meet what we need? So it's a very important public discussion.
Yeah, we will follow up on that. And, you know, one of the points you brought up was around VPP. That's been on our agenda, so to speak, but we've not really dug into it in a very major way. Grid shift, one of
That's what
our
I'm encouraging is let's
100%. So this becomes a resource allocation issue, frankly. So we are on it. So we actually are putting a design team together to get more impact in the coming year. And on the policy front also, this gets to the high penetration DER, that's what it's called. How do you change the market itself to encourage virtual power plants? The whole market needs to be changed, and that's where it gets to Director Fligor's question about alignment of incentives between the IOUs and CCAs. So I think there's a lot to be done here, and this is part of our strategic plan when we are looking at going to 24/7. Virtual power plants is one of those activities. So we will show you what we're going to be doing in a little more detail when we get to adopting the budget in the August-September timeframe.
Thank you. Director Chua.
Thank you, Chair. This is just a request, and I think I'm piggybacking on Director Lee's request. I need to know a little bit more about SNRs, small nuclear reactors. I don't know when you can present that, or in conjunction with the request from Director Lee, because that's kind of like a new thing, and I would like to know a little bit more. Thank you. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Girish.
Thank you. Vice Chair Tyson.
Well, I kind of waited because I'm slightly off topic here, but it looks like this is okay kind of timing. And so this is time to talk about my pet peeves about energy policy. Okay, are you ready? One of them is I don't know how many times I read in the San Jose Mercury a letter saying, why don't we do more ocean desalination? We're surrounded by water and we've got this drought. Why don't we do that? And I just got to say, if you look at the energy requirements to do that, it's just ridiculous, ridiculously high and expensive. And if people would put their effort into water recycling, that sounds to me like the way to go. Okay, that's point one. Number two, hydrogen fuel cells. Aren't they perfect? You consume hydrogen, all that's left is water. Well, how do you get hydrogen? 95% or more all comes from natural gas. And so if you say, I'm going to have a hydrogen fuel cell car instead of electric, all I'm doing is I'm pushing the carbon to somebody else. I'm not really fixing it until we have the totally green hydrogen. I don't know when that's coming. But speaking of technology, one of the things we haven't talked about here is, where's the CO2 going? And is there something else we can do? And just so you know, I pay close attention to technology, and I'm seeing some research that shows ways to take, say, the gas that comes from power plants and concentrate the CO2 and find a way to purify it and concentrate it. And you might say, well, why don't we just pump it back into the earth? Which in my view is not really solving the problem, just delaying it. And so I'm actually quite excited. I teach this class at Berkeley in engineering, and we're going to try a new project this fall. We're going to take recent technology and electrocatalytic conversion of CO2 into ethanol, because I think my students like to work on climate change and they love to find ways to make ethanol. And so those are the things. And by the end of this year, I'll be able to report back on whether I figured out a way to make it economical. Okay, there's the end of my little speech.
Great comments. Love to hear what your students are going to say. And I totally agree with you on the desalination, on that and many other levels. I have one other comment. We've got about 5 minutes left. This potential to have a wind carve out for a new demand. We've just seen what happened when they did a carve out for geothermal, when they increased our RA. It's just driving costs up. What do we think about how that influences? What can we do about those kind of situations where we're all going after the same resource? And as Monica said, there's certainly with wind, there's a huge time delay.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question to bring up. And we've had a few conversations back and forth internally. I don't think we really have a position at this point, but certainly within the IRP proceeding itself, the question has been raised as to whether for very specific carve outs like that, if it's appropriate to ask all LSEs to go out and do the procurement and create that competition, or if it would be more preferable for a central procurement entity, which right now is the IOUs, to do that procurement and then cost allocate it back to all customers. So I think that's going to be a conversation that happens within the IRP. I don't think we have a firm sort of position on which direction we feel is right, but I think you are right to point out that when the commission does these carve outs, it does impact the prices of those resources in the market. And with offshore wind, it's because of the way the ocean shelf works in California, it's definitely an emerging technology. You have to do floating offshore wind, which is has a lot of development risk associated with it as well.
Yeah, I mean, the impact, in addition to all the geopolitical things that are going on, the impact of those changes and the requirement for the geothermal, I mean, the geothermal price went up through the roof. Just, crazy. All right. I thank you all for your questions and participations. Do we have any final closing comments from Maren or Girish?
Nothing for me. I just very much appreciate everyone's time today.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank Maren and kind of I neglected to introduce Nick Pappas. And Nick, if you could, maybe Maren, we can shut the screen down, share. And I'd like to introduce Nick Pappas. He's in the middle of my screen. So Nick, maybe you can just introduce yourself to the board like a little bit.
Sure. Thanks, Girish. I'm Nick Pappas. I'm a consultant working with SVCE and really appreciate the opportunity to work with Maren and Monica and Girish on helping support both framing and developing some of the materials here today. Really encouraging to hear the discussion today and all the great thought that's been going into how we think about these long-term challenges.
Thank you, Nick. So we've got a lot of the questions and comments from the board. We'll distill some of that in terms of what we can provide offline to the board, and it'll also inform us in designing our next workshop. And as Maren said, we'd be coming to you with our IRP. Stay tuned. You will all be receiving a summer reading book from me. It is Vaclav Smil's How the World Really Works, which has to do with realism of how to actually decarbonize. And it's not just on electricity, it's every sector that we have. So you should be getting that in a week or two. So that's all I have. Back to you, Chair.
Well, that's an exciting, I wonder if we can put it on our library to read book list. Thank you all, particularly Maren. This is our really first chance to understand all of these in this context with your management. Thank you to Nick for complementing that work and helping really educate us as we hit these pivotal points of energy procurements and changes in the next years and many 5 years and 20 years to come. So thank you all. Thank you for coming, spending your time today, and we will see you in August, unless you have a committee meeting. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.